Scale and lamellar vie between them for three distinctions that set them apart from other forms of armour. Those distinctions are: which of them has the greater antiquity, which of them has the greater duration of use, and which of them has the wider geographical distribution. These are all interesting questions, yet never likely to be resolved with any certainty, and I don't intend to deal with them here, but rather something more specific. If you want to see both armours discussed in some detail, the book on screen is still available. And besides academic interest, it could also be of use should you want to make some type of scale armour or lamellar for yourself. In one aspect, lamellar far exceeds scale armour, and that is in the diversity of the ways it has been constructed over the millennia. Scale, in contrast, is much less variable and can be typified into a progression of 5 types, which are defined in the book. The progression is based upon two interrelated characteristics, going from the least rigid and therefore least protective to the most rigid and hence most protective. Over the decades, I've made a wide variety of lamellar, but much less scale, and the reasons are twofold. One is that the most basic and common varieties of scale armour, types 1 and 2 in the typology defined in Armour Never Wearies, are much more labour intensive for a result than many varieties of lamellar. The other reason is because the fewer variations lessen scale's ability to maintain the interest for a maker like me. A couple of types of scales had retained some interest, particularly the uniquely Roman variety known to the scholars as semi-rigid scale armour, in which the scales are not only connected horizontally with metal staples, as the Romans often did, but were also joined vertically by the same method. This construction is quite often mistaken for lamellar, and done using textile bindings, to a uniformly unhistorical and practically unsuccessful result. I wondered how semi-rigid scale was to make compared to the more familiar textile-backed forms of scale armour, and what it would be like to wear and use. Thus, when some suitable scrap metal came my way, as I cast about for a COVID-19 lockdown handcraft project, I decided that it was time to satisfy my curiosity. I had handmade all the scales for my first such armour many years ago, and have made plenty of lames since, so I was familiar enough with that side of the production process. What was newer was making staples. It did require a somewhat different technique from making the tens of thousands of mail rings that had been the feature of my first year in historical recreation, because staples had, of course, to be rectangular rather than round. I must say, though, that there was a certain sense of postmodern absurdity in the fact that I put all that effort into cutting a large sheet of iron into hundreds of small pieces, and then did more work punching thousands of holes with them, simply so I could do yet more work stapling them back together in a big sheet of metal. But that takes no account of the processes and economics of ironworking and armour making in antiquity, according to which it does all make sense. When it came to assembly, I found that it was a bit of a revelation. It was more akin to lamellar assembly than that of backed scale. The first stage was the same as the common method for Roman backed scale and analogous to most lamellar. That is, stapling the individual pieces together in a band that will be horizontal to the finished harness. It was the attachment of the rows that was the refreshing change from all that tedious, slow and awkward stitching required for a backed scale armour. Laid out like this, with supports at each end, an anvil in the middle for clenching the staples, and access on either side, it becomes tolerably rapid and a simple process that took a little over 1 hour to attach each body row of 57 scales. If the ends of the staples are well set to the interval of the holes, the placement of the holes on the scales makes it quite easy to slide the staples into place through both scales, working blind under the armour. As there are, to my knowledge, no semi-rigid scale loricae sufficiently well preserved to supply complete and reliable data, the overall form of the armour had to be speculative. For the main body structure, made in one piece and opening on the left, I took my inspiration from slightly later lamellar armours. One of my objectives was to have an armour that I might ride in should the occasion arise. For that, there are plenty of artistic precedents confirmed by my prior experience, dictating a different form to the Hecht Museum lorica seen earlier, which was probably for infantry. The shoulders were clearly going to be much more of an issue than with backed forms of scale, but I'd long since solved that matter in building my lamellar clavania, so I simply transferred that experience. The shoulder scales obviously had to be curved longitudinally, and then my design called for each of the 6 rows of the shoulders to be made of a tapered sequence of scales, so that they had a suitable amount of drop out from the neck. This didn't require any alteration in the layout of the scales, merely slightly in the lengths of each, so it didn't slow down the manufacture to any great degree. I'd initially designed the neck hole as symmetrical, but that left more of the cervical vertebra exposed than I wanted, while closing it up, even by 1 row, would make the opening too small for my head. Ancient armourers had solved that problem with a standing collar, and I could do no better than learn from them. I had initially planned for the shoulders to be closed, but then I figured that the armour would be much easier to store if it could open out flat, rather than being a fairly solid cylinder. Knowing that the banded armours, the so-called segmentata, had closures using turning pins and hooks, I decided to try the latter. This has turned out to have an enormous unexpected advantage. It makes the armour vastly easier to take off by unlatching the shoulders as shown before undoing the straps. One thing I'd discovered along the way in trying the partly finished item on was that the armour still needed a lining, because otherwise the staples catch on everything, not just my admittedly un-Roman hairstyle, but on any textile worn under it. That can then pull the staples open, making the problem still worse. Now finished to my satisfaction, it was time for testing. The testing was to be quite robust in one sense, because I do not yet have a thoracomarcus to wear under it, and so any defects of fit and function would quickly become acutely apparent. First, to take it out for a substantial walk and jog. That excursion revealed that it was surprisingly comfortable, despite the lack of any padding. As I said earlier, another objective was to have an armour I might ride in. I will not really know until I try it properly on a horse in motion, but at least I know that I can sit on a Roman saddle wearing the corselet. The final test, of course, was to confirm that it readily allowed the use of various appropriate weapons and a shield. Throw in javelins, a spear with a shield and without, and, of course, the sword. I acknowledge that my sword and shield style shown here is more about single combat duelling than the battlefield, and some would no doubt say for a later period, but it was a more rigorous test than melee fighting. All in all, I'm very satisfied with the result, and I look forward to the end of the pestilence, giving me the opportunity to go out and use it. I hope this has been interesting, and might give some viewer the encouragement to get him or herself a piece of this unjustly neglected variety of early Roman armour.